Did you ever wonder if the history you learned in school was the whole truth or just a carefully edited version? Think back to your old textbooks. They talked about heroes, victories, and progress. But how often did they mention the dark chapters? The cruelty? The injustice? Or the people who were silenced? Every year, millions of students across America open the same pages. Pages that tell them what happened, or rather, what someone wants them to believe happened. These textbooks shape how we see the world, how we understand justice, race, identity, and power. But what if they've been lying by omission? This video will take you down a path most classrooms never did. We'll uncover how American textbooks have whitewashed history, removing the uncomfortable truths, softening the horrors, and turning real struggles into shallow stories. And by the time you reach the end, you'll understand why this isn't just about the past. It's about control. It's about memory. And it's about why the truth matters now more than ever. Stay with me, because once you see how history was rewritten, you'll never read it the same way again. So what does it actually mean to whitewash history? It's not about painting walls or cleaning up facts. It's about hiding the ugly parts, changing the story to make it sound better than it really was. It's when history is rewritten to protect certain people's image or to make a country look more innocent than it truly is. Whitewashing happens in many ways. Sometimes, key events are left out completely. Other times, they're rewritten using softer, gentler words. Words that don't match the pain, violence, or injustice of what actually happened. It's not always about what is said. It's also about what's not said. For example, instead of calling something a massacre, a textbook might call it a conflict. Instead of enslaved people, it might say workers. Instead of genocide, it might say relocation. These small changes seem harmless, but they're not. They change how we see the past and how we feel about it. When you water down history, you also water down the lessons we're supposed to learn from it. The pain that should have made us reflect, it disappears. The injustice that should have made us angry, it feels like a mistake, not a crime. But who decides what goes into these books? That's where things get even more serious. School textbooks aren't written by one historian or teacher. They're created by publishers. Big companies. These publishers work with state education boards to decide what content is approved. That means history is filtered through political and business interests before it reaches students. In some states, especially ones with large school systems like Texas and Florida, textbook committees have a huge influence. If they don't like how something sounds, they can ask for it to be changed or removed. And because publishers want to sell as many books as possible, they usually listen. The result? A version of history that avoids controversy. A version that feels safe. A version that doesn't challenge the reader. And in many cases, a version that protects the feelings of some people while ignoring the truths of others. This isn't just a theory. It's been documented for decades. Historians, educators, and activists have all raised red flags about how American history is taught. But most people never notice because most of us only read what we were given in school. And once that version becomes familiar, it's hard to question it. But the truth is, history isn't supposed to be easy. It's supposed to be honest. When we talk about whitewashing history, we're talking about a system that chooses comfort over truth, that hides injustice instead of confronting it, that erases the voices of those who suffered to protect those who caused the suffering. And once you start to see it, you'll realize the whitewashing isn't rare. It's everywhere. Let's start with one of the biggest examples of whitewashing in American history, slavery and the Civil War. Open a history textbook from the past, and you'll see how carefully the story was softened. Slavery, the brutal system that lasted for more than 200 years, is often described in gentle terms. Some books called enslaved people workers or servants. Others said they were brought to America to help on plantations. Do you notice what's missing? The violence, the chains, the fact that millions of human beings were stolen from their homes, sold like property, and forced to live under constant terror. The reality of slavery was brutal. families torn apart at auctions, people beaten for speaking their language or learning to read, women abused by their so-called masters, generations trapped in a system designed to break their spirit. Yet in many classrooms, the story of slavery was reduced to a few pages. The suffering was hidden behind soft language. And then comes the Civil War. Ask many Americans, and they'll say it was fought over states' rights. That's what textbooks taught for decades. But let's be clear, the main right those states were fighting for was the right to own slaves. Southern leaders said this openly in their documents and speeches. They were not hiding it. But textbooks often turn the war into a debate over government power, not human freedom. Why does that matter? Because if you remove slavery from the center of the story, you change how people see the war. It's no longer about freedom versus oppression. It becomes about two equal sides disagreeing. And when both sides are framed as equal, the cruelty of slavery fades into the background. Even the aftermath was twisted. Some textbooks described Reconstruction, the period after the Civil War, as a failure because newly freed black people supposedly weren't ready for freedom. That framing shifts the blame away from the violence and discrimination they faced and onto the victims themselves. It suggests progress failed because of them, not because of the resistance of white supremacy. Think about what this does to students. A child reading that version of history won't feel the true weight of slavery. They won't understand the courage it took to resist it. They won't see how deeply it shaped America. Instead, they're left with a clean, polite version of events. A version that hides the crime, while making the country look less guilty. And here's the bigger problem. When history is taught this way, it doesn't just change how people see the past. It changes how they see the present. If slavery is softened, then the fight for civil rights looks less urgent. If the Civil War was just about states' rights, then racism today can be brushed aside as a misunderstanding. Whitewashing slavery and the Civil War doesn't just protect the past. It protects the inequalities that still exist now. And this is only one example. Next, let's talk about another group whose story was rewritten, or in many cases, erased entirely. If there's one part of American history that's been pushed to the side the most, it's the story of the indigenous people. Most textbooks start with a familiar tale. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. He discovered America. That's what we were told. But how can you discover a land where millions of people were already living? Native nations had their own languages, cultures, cities, and trade routes long before Europeans arrived. But in many textbooks, they barely get a few pages. Some aren't even named. Whole civilizations are reduced to the word tribes. Their knowledge, science, and political systems almost never mentioned. When Columbus arrived, it wasn't the start of a brave new world. It was the start of death, destruction, and loss. Over 90% of the indigenous population in the Americas was wiped out through violence, disease, starvation, and forced relocation. That's not a discovery. That's a genocide. But the textbooks didn't use that word. Instead, they used phrases like settling new land, westward expansion, or conflict with Native Americans. Words that sound clean and simple. Words that hide what really happened. When settlers moved west, they didn't just explore. They took land by force. They broke treaties again and again. They burned villages. They forced people to walk for miles with no food or shelter. This is what happened during the Trail of Tears, when thousands of Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole people were marched from their homes to new lands. Thousands died along the way. But most school books don't show that pain. They skip it, soften it, or frame it as part of building a nation. They turn violence into progress. And in doing so, they make it easier to forget. Even the language in textbooks is twisted. Native people are often described as resisting colonization or attacking settlers. But think about it. If someone invades your home and takes your land, are you attacking or defending? Textbooks also often ignore the deep spiritual, cultural, and political systems indigenous communities had. They aren't just a part of the past. They're still here, still fighting for their rights, their land, and their identity. But when history books erase their story, it makes it easier for the world to ignore their struggles today. And perhaps that's the goal, because when a nation wants to feel proud, it hides the things that cause shame. When a country wants to feel innocent, it forgets the people it hurt. Indigenous history is not just a side note. It's not something to glance over in one chapter. It's central to understanding how America was truly built. And yet, most students never get the full story. They only see the version that was approved, edited, and polished. But once you know what's missing, you start to see the whole picture. When American textbooks talk about the civil rights movement, the story sounds inspiring. Peaceful marches, brave speeches, laws changed, country healed. But that version is only half the truth. The civil rights movement wasn't a clean and polite chapter in American history. It was full of tension, danger, violence, and resistance from both sides. It was a fight, a real, painful, risky fight for freedom and dignity. But many school books don't show it that way. Let's start with Martin Luther King Jr. Everyone knows his name. Most students learn a few lines from his "I Have a Dream" speech. They hear about peace, unity, and hope. But what about the rest? Textbooks rarely show how deeply unpopular Dr. King was during his time. Many Americans thought he was dividing the country. He was watched by the FBI. He was arrested over 20 times. And in his later years, he spoke against the Vietnam War, against capitalism, and against deep systemic racism in the North, not just the South. That part? Left out. Because if you only show the peaceful dreamer and not the radical truth-teller, you make his message easier to digest, safer, more comfortable. The system that once feared him now rewrites him. And what about Malcolm X? For years, textbooks either ignored him or labeled him as violent. That's it. No context, no explanation, no chance for students to understand his logic, his pain, his transformation. Malcolm X wasn't just angry. He was insightful, disciplined, and unafraid to speak about racism in its global, economic, and psychological forms. He challenged the idea that Black people needed to be peaceful to earn their rights. He talked about pride, self-defense, and dignity. But many books still avoid him because his message doesn't fit the peaceful protest narrative schools prefer. Then there's Rosa Parks. In most classrooms, she's described as a tired old woman who refused to give up her seat on a bus. But that's only a small piece of the truth. Rosa Parks was a trained activist. She had worked for years with the NAACP. Her protest wasn't random. It was part of a planned effort. She wasn't just tired. She was tired of injustice. By turning her into a passive figure, the system removes her strategy, her bravery, and her power. This is how whitewashing works. It keeps the names, but removes the fire. It celebrates the heroes, but forgets the struggle. It shows the victories, but hides the cost. The marches met with dogs and fire hoses. The protests faced beatings and bombs. The leaders followed, threatened, jailed, and murdered. But textbooks still try to tell a simple story. Good people marched. The government listened. Problem solved. That lie is dangerous. Because if students believe that change came easily, they might think injustice today isn't worth fighting. They might not realize how much courage it takes to resist a system. They might forget how long, hard, and painful that road really is. The civil rights movement wasn't a peaceful walk. It was a battlefield. And we owe the truth to everyone who walked it. So far, we've seen how stories are softened, details are skipped, and painful truths are replaced with feel-good summaries. But here's the question we haven't asked yet. Who decides what goes into the textbooks? And more importantly, who decides what gets left out? Most people assume that history books are written by historians, that experts carefully research events and present the facts. But the truth is more complicated and more political. In the United States, textbooks are mostly written by private publishing companies. These companies don't just write whatever they want. They want to make money. And to do that, they need to get their books approved by state education boards. That's where things get interesting. In some states, especially large ones like Texas and Florida, the state has enormous power over what's taught in schools. These states review and approve textbooks for all their public schools. Because they buy in such large quantities, publishers often design books just to please them. If a textbook is too controversial, it risks being rejected. If it talks too much about racism, inequality, or protest, it might be labeled as divisive. If it includes LGBTQ plus history, or uses terms like white privilege or systemic racism, it might be removed entirely. And so, many publishers stay safe. They avoid strong language. They rewrite difficult topics. They remove anything that could be seen as uncomfortable. And here's the scary part. The people making those decisions are not historians. They're often politicians, school board members, or political activists. Some of them openly push for certain versions of history to be taught, ones that protect traditional American values or erase the parts of the past that challenge them. In recent years, this fight has gotten louder. Some states have passed laws banning the teaching of so-called critical race theory, even though that theory is rarely part of actual K-12 lessons. These laws have been used to ban books, silence teachers, and block discussions about racism, slavery, and inequality. So what happens? Teachers are scared. Schools avoid tough topics. And students grow up learning a filtered, edited version of the past. This isn't just about education. It's about power. Because when you control the past, you shape how people see the present. If you can convince students that racism ended in the 1960s, they won't notice it now. If you erase protests from history, today's protests look unreasonable. If you hide injustice, no one feels the need to fix it. This is why whitewashing isn't just a mistake. It's a strategy. History isn't just what happened. It's what we're told happened. And when that story is controlled by politics and profit, truth becomes the first thing to disappear. The past isn't dead. It's being edited. And now, the question becomes, who is brave enough to read beyond the page? You might be thinking, so what if history books leave out a few things? The past is the past. Does it really matter now? Yes. It matters more than most people realize. Because when you change the way people see the past, you change the way they understand the present. Think about it. If a student learns that America has always been fair and just that everyone had equal opportunity from the beginning, then they'll grow up believing that anyone who struggles today must be doing something wrong. They won't see systems. They won't see injustice. They'll only see individuals. But if you learn the truth that some groups were enslaved, displaced, or excluded for generations, then you start to understand why the effects of that history are still here. You see why wealth isn't evenly spread, why some communities are over-policed, why some people have to work twice as hard just to be seen. Whitewashing history doesn't just erase pain, it erases context. It tells you the finish line is fair without showing you that some people had to run with chains on their legs. And there's more. When students grow up reading history that hides protest, they don't know their power. They're taught that change happens slowly, politely, through systems. But real history shows something different. Change came because people marched, fought, resisted, demanded. And often, they were punished for it. Textbooks make it look neat. But it wasn't. It was messy, bloody, and brave. So when young people don't see that struggle, they might stop believing in their own voice. They might think protesting is too extreme, that speaking up is too risky. They won't know that nearly every right we enjoy today was won by someone who refused to stay silent. This is why whitewashing is so dangerous. It doesn't just change what we know, it changes who we become. And here's something else. When we hide the truth, we lose the chance to heal. You can't fix a wound if you pretend it was never there. You can't grow as a nation if you refuse to face the parts of yourself that are painful. Real strength isn't found in pride. It's found in honesty, in the courage to admit what went wrong, and the will to do better. Teaching the full truth of history doesn't divide people. It prepares them. It gives them tools. It shows them that injustice has been beaten before, and it can be beaten again. but it starts with knowledge. And knowledge starts with truth. So yes, it matters. What we teach in school shapes who we are. What we choose to forget shapes who we hurt. And now that you've seen how the past was edited, the real question is, what will you do with the truth? The truth isn't always easy. It's uncomfortable. It challenges what we thought we knew. But facing it is the only way forward. History isn't meant to make us feel proud. It's meant to make us think, to feel, to grow. So don't stop here. Question what you were taught. Read beyond the textbooks. Listen to voices that were left out. Because the more you learn, the harder it becomes to stay silent. If this made you think, even for a moment, share it. Let's stop repeating lies and start remembering truth. Together, we write the next chapter.